Minister, I have to say that the income tax section in the Finance Bill and indeed in the explanatory memorandum has to be one of the shortest that I've ever seen in any budget. And it's basically short because in most years there would be some attempt to index tax bands and allowances to the level of expected wage increase in the next year. And while I accept that you have had to act with some caution in respect to Brexit and to give it significant consideration, nonetheless it is quite astonishing that in a situation where, as you yourself said, I think on budget day, but you've certainly said it on a number of occasions, that you expect low average income increases for most workers to be around 3% mark, and in some cases up to 4.5%. Now, the failure in any way to index tax bands means that for the majority of ordinary workers, the budget is very regressive. And given your previous commitment to developing greater equality in Irish society, the conscious decision to opt for a regressive budget at a time of a threatening Brexit is, in my view, really wrong. The budget could have made proper provision for Brexit, but it need not have penalised ordinary workers at the lower levels of income in the way that it did, and yet have one single increase, welcome and all as it is, in relation to the home carer credit from $1,500 to $1,600. That's an increase of 100. And the item in section 4 to increase the earned income credit for self-employed people from 1,350 to 1,500. That's an increase of 150. And that really is it. In fact, we have significant sections in Section 8, which proposes, notwithstanding the research that people like myself have done in relation to how the Special Assignee Relief Programme has developed. And you yourself have actually shared and commented with some level of agreement on how this programme is actually, in effect, being abused and has become excessive. Instead, what you've done is that you're providing in Section 8 that relief from income tax on 30% of salary between 75,000 and 1 million to qualifying employees under the SARP relief. That in effect what you're doing is you're proposing to extend the Special Assignee Relief Programme to December 22. Now, you're doing that in the context of giving a very large and significant benefit for at least another couple of years to people who are indeed highly paid, going up to the levels of people who are paid up to 1 million a year as qualifying employees. And, you know, again, in terms of any sense of equality, but I believe what you've done now is excessive, and I don't think it's required. And it is the reason, of course, that the ESRI last week, when they had a look at the budget, I know it didn't get very much publicity, but they said that the budget was very, very clearly regressive. And I want to point out a number of things. In relation to the losses across the board arising from freezing of the tax bands. So incomes are going up, but tax bands for workers on PAYE are being frozen. Fiscal drag, they end up paying more tax. That's very clearly regressive, and it gives you a very large extra bounce in terms of tax flows into the economy. We also have a situation because of the distinction between people in employment and people who are self-employed. When I was Minister, I specifically launched a number of reviews in cooperation with your department, as you know, in relation to bogus self-employment. People recognise that self-employed people who work hard are deserving of consideration, and we've welcomed the long-awaited, long-promised further increase this year in the relief for the self-employed. But, you know, the differential now, because there's no comparative contribution in terms of areas like the social insurance contributions, means that the incentive for bogus self-employment is potentially become much higher in this budget. Now, I am sure you could find a way to actually address that, and I would hope that in conversations in respect of the details of the bill that we will look at that. You've given something like 80 million of tax breaks in various ways to businesses, including increasing the inheritance tax threshold by 15 million a year. Again, what I'm talking about in this context, Minister, is that you have failed to offer people, whether on social welfare incomes or on low earned incomes, any improvement at all, except in a couple of very narrow cases. We also have, and you had this in previous years, and we'll have time to tease it out in the budget, you've a number, as you said yourself last year, I think it was, that you were going to cast your eye around and see were there tax-raising measures that you could identify from better compliance procedures. And they account for about 175 million of the additional money that you expect. Well, I wish you luck that we will get that money and maybe more. But again, I think that's something we will need to discuss when we talk about the detail of the bill. In terms of carbon tax, the €2 increase to the fuel allowance won't really help the most vulnerable people. When we were still emerging from a very difficult collapse, I was able to increase the fuel allowance by €2.50 a week. Your increase, which is the only social welfare increase for roughly half the year, at €2 a week, means that a household on social protection will literally get, on average, a household will get €1 a week. So you could hardly describe yourself as some kind of Santa Claus in the run-up to Christmas. On welfare issues in general, welfare, the failure to raise means has meant and will mean a real cut in living standards for people heavily dependent on social welfare. The key things about people who are on retirement pension, who are carers, who have a disability, and who are therefore likely to be very long-term recipients of social welfare, is that they have no capacity, Minister, to go out and find a job or to work extra hours. They just don't have that capacity. And this is one issue I want to take up with you and indeed with your colleague, the Minister for Social Protection. The failure to actually address these issues in the case of the carers being allowed a number of hours a week to work can result in them falling into a tax threshold. Now, this happens in any budget where there are increases, and I do want to hear from you that you have proposals, or your colleague has proposals to actually address that differential, because when people are on quite low incomes, everything does count. And understandably, people have to budget probably far harder than a Minister for Finance has to budget to make sure that they are able to meet their absolute necessities. What has been said by the ESRI in relation to this budget and its regressiveness is that while there are losses across the board, the loss at the top levels of income is about 1%. But the losses at the lower levels to low-income households will be about 3%. Now, that is actually a real black mark against the budget, that you would have so inverted the expectations about fairness and equality that you would actually produce a budget which would have a much worse outcome for less well-off people than it will have for people at the very top of the income scale. And remember, less well-off people, a lot of them are in work, and they are the people getting up in the morning. In fact, a lot of wealthy people don't even have to get out of bed. A lot of them do, but a lot of them don't have to, and we don't know whether they do or not. So, given the kind of rhetoric that your government has employed in respect of people who get up and are active all day, every day, so are most pensioners, so are most carers, so are most people with a disability. And you've really actually ensured that they are going to be left further behind. In the context of a no-deal, Minister, and you posited and positioned the budget around taking account of Brexit and a no-deal situation. What I have to say there is, if there is a no-deal, we have had a very extensive discussion in this country, and one of the things that we know is that in that context we may have significant price rises in certain foods, particularly manufactured, compounded, processed foods coming into Ireland from the UK. Now, a lot of these foods form significant parts of the diets of people on the lowest incomes because they are available from major supermarkets where families buy and individuals buy a lot of their grocery shopping. And yet, in building the budget around Brexit, you seem to have entirely forgotten the argument about the price rises that families are going to be likely to be subject to. The tax and the benefit thresholds, as I said, have not kept pace with inflation. Lone parents and pensioner couples have lost out most. And again, I'm quoting from the ESRI, and the targeted measures from the ESRI analysis have not gone far enough. I seldom read a more devastating analysis by the ESRI of any budget of the last decade since the crash than I've read of this, because we are talking in a time when, as you said yourself, and assuming that Brexit works out in a soft Brexit, or better still, and we all agree on this, with no Brexit at all, it's astonishing, really, that you should have targeted your measures in such a regressive way. It's difficult to understand. Now, you had alternatives, and the Labour Party put forward alternatives. We have this extraordinary situation where the banks in Ireland, for the foreseeable future, will pay no tax. At the insistence of my party, and particularly, if I may say so, of myself, when I was in government, I insisted and eventually won the case with your predecessor, Mr Noonan, of having the banking levy. Those were the days when the banking system was barely returning to recovery and to profitability. The banks have now been improving year by year by year. They are, if you like, fattening themselves up, presumably to sell themselves off to international buyers. All I can say is that it is astonishing that you did not consider increasing by a significant amount the bank levy, because either banks should pay corporations tax. Banks should pay corporation tax. There should be a limit on the losses, notwithstanding the losses that they have available. they should have to pay a minimum rate of corporation tax in each financial year on the profits that they generate. I got one of your predecessors, Brian Lenihan, to agree to that. And it's a very simple measure. The alternative is the bank levy. And I have to say, I'm really disappointed that you didn't review that. Now, I can write and post it to you all of the excuses that the banks will make as to why they should make no contribution in terms of the plus billions of profits that they are now earning. And in fact, some of them have gone over the individual mark on an individual banking basis. Again, in terms of equity, in terms of any kind of just taxation system, it is deeply wrong that Fine Gael refuses to address the issue of actually asking validly for an appropriate contribution from the banks. They collapsed. They collapsed because of their behaviour. Who bailed them out? The people of this country, the people who pay PAYE. Who took the salary cuts? The people in public service took the salary cuts. And, you know, all we're saying to the banks is very simply, we welcome you being in recovery, but we want every penny of it back, or as many pennies of it back as we can actually get. Why do we want it? We want it because the bank crash that you caused, that the banks caused, has ended up with, in particular, a really difficult situation in relation to our health service, an absolutely extraordinary situation in relation to our housing services, and a whole series of serious requests for the further development of higher education, in particular, which is actually one of the reasons we attract so much foreign investment. Investment in primary and secondary education so that our children can go on to be successful in school, to be successful in college, to be successful in apprenticeships. And we need more investment in preschool education because, as you know, Minister, notwithstanding the rather tepid additions that you've made in relation to preschool education this year, and it still has to be worked out, and they are welcome, but they are rather tepid. We will still have net one of the highest childcare costs in Europe. And the reality, Minister, and I see you smiling, is that what is happening is that the childcare providers inevitably are using the fact that there are very modest improvements in the arrangements for supporting parents who have children in preschool and in childcare, is to simply charge extra fees. So the moment there's an item in the paper that parents are going to see an increase in terms of support for childcare, there's an almost automatic reaction that childcare prices rise. And our childcare prices, as I'm sure you're aware yourself, are really among the highest in Europe. In fact, we actually need not so much what the subsidy is now turning out to be. The subsidy is turning out to be an incentive to the providers of the childcare to raise the prices. So in terms of classical conservative economics, it's a subsidy gone wrong. And in fact, what we need to look at is a state childcare model that, like primary education, is provided by the state, and the people who are qualified to work in that sector receive decent salaries appropriate to their qualifications, and recognising their skills and the importance of this sector in terms of young children and babies. I also want to say, in relation to the minimum wage, I am glad, because I raised it in budget night, that that your colleague, the Minister for Social Protection, had essentially decided and said so in her budget press conference that was being parked until we were sure about Brexit. But again, in terms of the people who get up in the morning and who go out and work, it was absolutely appalling that you should have suggested that a 30 cent an hour increase to people on the lowest wages would actually be parked, while the people earning 75,000 to 1 million would actually get a tax benefit. I mean, where's the justice, where's the equality, and where's the progressiveness in that? I can't find it, Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Paul.